and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The theme of this year's World No Tobacco Day, which is observed every year on 31st of May, is Unmasking the Appeal. It's a call to expose how tobacco and nicotine industries shape perception, influence policy, and push their products despite the cost to public health. Now, a new report by the think tank Social and Economic Research Initiative argues that Malaysia's tobacco control efforts have been losing steam recently, and that one of the most effective tools that we have is also one of the most unused: taxation. So joining us on the show to discuss this more is the author of the aforementioned report, Muhammad Daniel Kittu, who is a research analyst at SERI, where he specialises in health economics. Welcome to the show, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining me. Okay, so talk to me, I want to start broad, and maybe we can begin with why you think Malaysians should care about a tobacco tax reform right now. I think this is coming at a time when vape regulation, vape banning is the focus of headlines, is what people are talking about. So why do you argue that tobacco taxation should also be a focus?
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. So the reason that tobacco taxation is very important, despite the fact there's a lot of attention on vapes, is because the smoking prevalence for conventional cigarettes is actually a lot more higher compared to e-cigarettes. Okay. So in 2023, it's around 16.8% for conventional cigarettes, but for vapes, it's only about 5.8%. So, but the reason there's been a lot of attention on vapes is because there's been such a huge increase between 2011 and 2023, which is, I think, about from 0.8% to 5.8%. So
okay,
that's like
it started from a low base
exactly,
and it went up.
Exactly. We know that is important, but it's important that we not lose focus on conventional cigarettes. So suppose that we have the best case scenario and vapes are effectively banned. Mm-hmm. But what happens to those who are already hooked on these products? They've already had a taste of nicotine. So there's a good chance that they're going to turn to conventional cigarettes because it's still legal. And it has been more affordable over time because we haven't had an increase in tobacco taxes since 2015. Right.
Okay. Let's unpack all the things that you said. Quite a number of interesting but disturbing facts that you've raised. 16.8% is the smoking prevalence, you said. That's quite high for a country like Malaysia. I noted in your report that you said it had been on a declining trend, but smoking rates in Malaysia have appeared to have plateaued in recent years. Talk to me about this. Why do you believe that this has been, what's been contributing to this trend?
So first, I should also clarify that 16.8% is just for conventional cigarettes. So if you're talking about overall smoking tobacco products, it's actually around 19%.
19%?
Exactly.
Wow.
So the reason I'm focusing on cigarettes is because that's the smoking product that has the highest prevalence. So yeah, the reason is because without taxes on these products, they become more affordable over time because of rising GDP per capita. And so because of that, it's become more affordable relatively over time. So that's why it's important to have regular increases on tobacco products so that you basically prevent these products from being more affordable over time.
Okay, all right. Talk to me about affordable over time. So when we talk about affordability, what does it mean in this context?
So what that essentially means in terms of affordability, so suppose from 2016 to 2022, we have not had an increase in tobacco taxes. And at the same time, so what that essentially also means that the nominal prices haven't really changed much. Okay. So as a result, as people's income grows over time, that becomes more affordable, so they have more disposable income. So without any measures that reduce the affordability of these products, because they're addictive products, so without any effective measures that increase the prices of these products, they're going to be, well, there's not much of an incentive for people to try to stop or reduce consumption or quit completely.
Okay, all right. So the idea is to continue raising the prices as income also increases. Before I read your report, Daniel, I have to say I hadn't realized just how long it had been since Malaysia saw an excise tax increase. And I cover the budget every year, and you know, it's one of the things we look out for. In fact, it feels like it's the lowest hanging fruit for the government to increase tax revenue. But we haven't had one in 10 years. Yeah. It's been 10 years since we've had a tax increase. Your report talks about raising the excise tax from, is it currently 40 cents per stick?
That's right, yeah.
Currently 40 cents per stick to 63 cents per stick. Talk to me a little bit about the rationale behind that figure. Right now, if I'm not mistaken, how much are conventional cigarette prices, and what would that take it to?
So a pack is about 17 ringgit. So the reason of my suggestion of increasing it to 0.63 cents, well, that's really just a bare minimum to bring it back to the affordability levels in 2016.
Okay.
So even,
that's the floor you're hoping for.
Yeah. So the reason I'm highlighting that is to show that this is what happens when you don't pay attention to this. This is what happens when you don't increase tobacco taxes for the past 10 years. But I think another key thing to remember is, so once this can't be a one-off thing. There needs to be regular increases in tobacco taxation. So one of my recommendations is to align with the recommendations by the WHO, so which is to increase it by inflation plus income growth. So that essentially ensures that tobacco products, especially cigarettes, become less affordable over time.
Okay.
So that gives the more incentive for smokers to quit or at least reduce their tobacco consumption. Okay.
So you're saying if the bare minimum of an excise tax increase should be 63 cents per stick, and that would take cigarette prices per pack up to 22 ringgit
around
plus.
That price,
Okay,
yeah.
And that is according to 2016 affordability figures?
Yep. That's
so
right.
It could be much more
It could be much more.
2025 affordability
exactly.
figures.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you project the outcomes to be in terms of a reduction? If the government says, you know, this budget, the government says, hey, we're going to increase tobacco tax, excise tax to 70 cents per stick, or even 63 cents per stick, the bare minimum that you're recommending. What would be the benefits? What would be the projected outcome in terms of a reduction in cigarette consumption, for instance?
So the most important aspect to reducing consumption is that it reduces healthcare burdens on individuals and our overstretched healthcare system. So if we want to understand how this impacts individuals, it's also important to consider a lot of other factors.
Yeah.
So it's not only about reducing consumption, it's also about being able to raise revenue.
Yes. So
the thing about tobacco products is it's widely known that they're very addictive. So as a result of that, they're deemed as being price inelastic. So what that essentially means is that any price increase is relatively larger compared to the quantity of demand that's decreased. So that's the consumption. So that's why it's described as a sort of win-win situation where you can increase revenue but at the same time reduce consumption of these products.
Okay. Well, you mentioned in your report that tobacco taxation is pro-poor. You said tobacco taxation is progressive. Can you maybe unpack that for me? Why would raising tobacco tax be good for those in the lower income?
Yeah. So I guess the reason why people might push back against it is because consumption taxes tend to generally be regressive, but something like tobacco taxes are actually kind of unique because, generally low-income individuals are a lot more price sensitive to these products. So if there are sharp increases, so that's quite key here, there needs to be sharp increases in order to observe an impact on a significant impact in reducing consumption.
Right. Okay. When you say sharp increases, there was an example that you mentioned in your report. Was it Brazil?
That's right, yeah.
That had done this sharp increase and saw good outcomes. Yeah. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so I believe they increased their excise taxes by 62% between 2012.
62%?
Yeah, between 2012 and 2014. And they were also able to increase revenue and reduce consumption. So another thing that's also important to highlight that, so like Brazil has a problem with illicit trade of cigarettes. Similar to Malaysia, we do have a problem with illicit trade of cigarettes. And this also comes back to why tobacco taxes haven't increased for the past 10 years. Quite often there is this argument that, you know, if you increase the taxes on cigarettes, increase their prices, that's going to drive the scale of illicit trade. But that's actually not true. It's actually a lot more complex than that and more nuanced.
Okay.
So there are a lot of other factors that actually contribute to the scale of illicit trade, and that's really corruption and the lack of enforcement.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious about that. And I have heard that narrative before, Daniel, that I think there's a common pushback against increasing any kind of tobacco tax because, you know, they say that it is the driver of illicit trade. What does the data actually tell us about this claim?
Yeah. So like in my report, I did highlight a study that was done by some researchers from UPM. So they did essentially build this econometric model. So that essentially kind of showed that that it wasn't the legal prices of cigarettes that were the driving factor of illicit trade, but rather it was enforcement. So and that was really measured through the transparency index or the corruption perception index, which measures essentially it's an indicator of the level of corruption in a country. So actually another thing that's actually quite interesting, it's not mentioned in my report, but what I noticed that between 2012 and 2014, so we had increases in taxes back then.
Okay.
And there were increases in tax revenue during that period. But then after 2015, so the last tax increase in 2015, there wasn't much of an increase in tax revenue. The reason is because of the level of corruption. So actually, if you just go to Transparency International's website, if you look between 2012 and 2014, the level of corruption was actually quite stable at that period. And as you can see from my report, that there was quite a significant increase in revenues at that period. But in 2015, I think we all know what was going on in the country back then. We had high levels of systemic corruption, and as a result of that, that increase in tobacco taxation didn't really bring out the outcomes that we wanted, which is an increase in tax revenue. Right? But so the difference with why we can do this now is it does seem that the government is quite serious in tackling corruption and in dealing with enforcement. So like in my report, I highlighted the formation of AKPS, which is the new agency that's formed, I think, under the Home Ministry. So that essentially consolidates like more than 20 agencies. So to try to reduce duplications of any kind of enforcement that they need to address enforcing against like any kind of illicit good.
Right, yeah. I also thought it was quite interesting the point you raised in your report about the track and trace system, because why not use technology to be able to combat illicit trade? So if we were able to monitor the movement of tobacco, it would make it much easier to combat illicit trade. Talk to me about that. Is this a hard system to implement? Is this something that is feasible in a market in a country like Malaysia?
It's not really unfeasible. It's something that's been used in many countries. Okay. So what it involves is essentially is that you have a scannable code on a cigarette pack. So an someone with an enforcement officer could scan that code, and that would take them to a secure database that essentially tracks the movement of that pack of cigarettes across the supply chain, so from the point of production to the point of sale. So it's supposed to tell you where it should be. So if it's not where it's supposed to be, that tells you that this is being sold illegally.
Okay, all right. And you say this is being done elsewhere as well? Okay, so maybe if we are able to use these tools to combat illicit trade, then there really is no kind of excuse not to increase tobacco tax going forward. How does our tax rate and affordability rate compare to other countries? Are we behind the curve? Are we what's happening in other countries around the world that you've looked at?
Yeah, so we do have one of the lowest legal cigarette prices. So in terms of affordability, which I think is key, especially affordability trends, we're comparing it to countries like Thailand, Singapore. So our trends are a lot more concerning because of how much more affordable they've become. And especially the Philippines. Philippines is actually a good example of how they've addressed the affordability of cigarettes.
Okay.
Because since 2012, they've had regular increases in tobacco taxation. So that's allowed them to address tobacco consumption. So actually, in fact, I believe since around 2015, 2016, they've actually surpassed Malaysia in terms of tobacco use prevalence, which is kind of disappointing, because we were actually ahead of them in terms of the level of tobacco use prevalence. But now we have kind of fallen behind.
Wow, it means we have higher rates of tobacco use compared to the Philippines.
Exactly.
Yes, wow, that's really quite shocking, because it was only a few years ago that I remember the kind of, you know, the stereotype of countries around ASEAN, and we think, oh, we're doing quite well.
Yeah.
When we look at the smoking prevalence, and if you want to make the case of just traditional cigarettes, Malaysia has a target, if I'm not mistaken, of reducing smoking to below 15%. Is it 15% by 2025?
Yeah, that's right,
and then below 5% by 2040?
Yeah, 2030 or 2040.
Okay,
yeah,
so is that a realistic goal? Are we on track? I mean, for this year, do we make the goal of 15%?
That's hard to say. I would be quite pessimistic, to be honest. But with that being said, that doesn't mean we can't do anything right now. Like, I think the focus is what our next steps are going to be. So I think by the next budget, we need to increase tobacco taxes. It's been 10 years, it's been a decade.
Right.
So, and we have to lock in regular increases so that this doesn't become a problem in another 10 years from now.
I'm assuming taxation is only one tool in our toolkit.
Yeah.
What are the other tools that need to be used concurrently with taxation that can help us achieve a lower smoking prevalence rate?
So actually, when it comes to other forms of tobacco control, the Malaysian government has done a pretty good job. So like an example is the point of sale display ban.
Okay.
Right. So that's been recently been passed, and I think it's going through a phased implementation. So
what is the point of sale display
So
ban?
essentially, it hides these tobacco products behind a cabinet. So that
don't
basically
we still
reduces.
see it right now? I mean, we
So
go to a convenience store and it's behind the cashier.
Exactly.
Yeah?
So it's meant to, it's going through a phased implementation now. So it's supposed to be completed by October.
Okay.
Yeah.
Something to watch out for in terms of development. Okay.
But if I'm being honest, I'm doubtful that that's going to have much of an impact by the end of the year, because between October to December, there's not much time. So even then, that's probably not going to have as much of an impact as we wanted.
So that's what point of sale
display.
Yeah. Are there anything else? Are there other tools that need to be implemented for us to achieve the goal?
So another aspect which I touched on was also addressing illicit trade of cigarettes. So even though we are, of course, increasing cigarette prices don't drive illicit trade, but it still exists, and we do have to address it, because there are going to be a segment of the population that are going to turn to illicit cigarettes. It doesn't mean everyone will, but it is something that needs to be addressed. And also, tobacco taxes can actually be used to actually fund this sort of initiatives. So, for example, perhaps for the first thing that the government could do is allocate revenue raised from these taxes to enforcing against illicit trade of cigarettes. So, essentially, these are the same authorities that deal with illicit goods in general, anyways. So, funding these enforcement agencies would at least be able to help address this, I guess you could say, the black market in cigarettes. Then, by the long term, another option would be to allocate these revenues to smoking cessation products or smoking cessation programs. So that basically offers a way out for smokers, a way for them to quit. So what's key here is that, so with smoking cessation products, you could get them from a government hospital, for example, but the problem is, I think, even I myself have experienced this, it's not easy to go through a public healthcare system. It's hard to get appointments and so on. So there are like options that are available out of pocket, but they can be a lot more expensive. And what's concerning and disappointing is a lot of these smoking cessation products tend to be a lot cheaper than cigarettes. So what incentive do people have to want to quit smoking? Because it's cheaper to to continue smoking.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, does the same apply? I'm just wondering because, so you talked about regulation, you know, point of sales display, taxation, the like. There's enforcement that you mentioned about illicit cigarettes. Does education play a part of it? Because can we stop the practice of smoking instead of focusing on the cessation of smoking?
I would say, yeah, education is important, but I do think at this point most people are aware about the harms of
So it's
smoking.
not a lack of information that's causing people to start smoking.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the key thing is actually affordability. So I know I mentioned about how low-income individuals are more price sensitive, but that also applies to younger people. So essentially higher cigarette prices actually act as a deterrent to younger smokers trying to pick up the habit. Because if it's more expensive, and obviously younger individuals tend to be earning less. So addressing this by increasing taxes, which will essentially increase the prices of these products, will act as a deterrent from younger people to pick up the habit of smoking.
Does it make sense to tax vape more aggressively, just like conventional cigarettes? Or does vape warrant a different fiscal approach?
Generally speaking, the best practice would be to tax vapes, but we have to consider the context in Malaysia. So we have a huge problem with, I think, with illicit drugs being used in vapes because of how customizable these products are. So there is a case for wanting to ban these products as opposed to just taxing them. But to be honest, only time will tell how effective this is. So actually what's key here is actually enforcement. So as I said enforcement against these products will be done by the same agencies anyways. So that's why actually increasing taxes on tobacco products could be used to at least have an additional source of revenue to essentially fund these agencies so that they can more effectively enforce these bans.
Okay. Yeah. This year's World No Tobacco Day theme, I really think is quite interesting because it calls on governments to unmask the appeal of tobacco and nicotine products. I'm just wondering, Daniel, from your research, what do you see as some of the tactics that have been typically used maybe in the past or in other countries or elsewhere that shape perception, that shape policy? How have you seen what's been documented or done before?
Yeah. So in terms of what happens in general, the worst case scenario is for a situation of state capture to occur, especially when it comes to the Ministry of Finance. Now, I'm not saying this is going on in Malaysia, but this does happen in various countries where the Ministry of Finance might be listening too closely with the tobacco industry, and that essentially deters them from actually increasing taxes on their products. There's also a lot of like corporate social responsibility activities that the industry conducts, which is essentially a way to launder their reputation. At the end of the day, the product that they're selling is a harmful product. So why are we acting as if this is normal? So that's why under the WHO's Article 5.3 of the FCTC, which is the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and which Malaysia is a signatory to, the policymakers are meant to protect public health policy from vested interests, i.e. the interests of the tobacco industry. So what that essentially means is you're not really supposed to bother with them. You're meant to ensure whatever policies you're implementing are for the good of public health, and not for the profits of the tobacco industry or any industry for that matter. Yeah.
Well, in the minute or so that we have left, can I ask you what message you would like to give to our audience tonight? And they could be, you know, public, even people who smoke or don't smoke, or even policymakers who may be thinking about tobacco control policies. What message would you like to leave them with, given that you've put in all this work into your report? What's the takeaway message tonight, Daniel?
I'd say it's time to increase taxes on tobacco products. I'll mention a quote by Adam Smith, who's widely known as the father of modern economics. So he said, "Sugar, rum, and tobacco are commodities that are nowhere near essential, and thereby they are perfect for taxation."
There you go. It's been 10 years since we've seen excise tax increase. Thank you so much for being on the show and sharing the results of your work today. Thank you. I appreciate your time. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.